Okay, good afternoon, Dad. Today is
Good
Wednesday,
morning.
July 30th. Good afternoon. Um, okay, so what's on
Mhm.
your mind? What's the biggest news story? I'll let you guide me.
The biggest news story. Okay, well, I don't know if it's the biggest news story, but I was just thinking about the tariffs, and I guess recently, Trump went from saying 50 days to 10 or 20 days, 10 to 12, now just 10 days, a firm 10 days, and uh, Russia has to uh, agree to a ceasefire or there will be penalties. And that's not even clear what the penalties are supposed to be. There will be sanctions. He didn't even say exactly what it was. Originally when he gave the 50 days, I guess we can assume it's the same thing. It was 100% secondary tariffs. In other words, 100% tariffs on countries that buy energy products from Russia. So maybe that's what we're talking about. But the amazing thing is, I know I was talking about last time that the markets aren't reacting. They just don't not paying any attention to what he's saying. And I was just reading that even Russian social media is not reacting. It used to be that every statement by Trump was analyzed, and different people interpreted his statement in one way and others another, and they argued about it. And what would the consequences for Russia be? Now this is something that you say could be money, have enormous consequences, but there's very little discussion. People just aren't paying attention to what he's saying. It's a case of uh, you know, um, he's bluffed too many times. He's cried wolf too many times. And, he just makes so many off the wall statements that, that he's ignored. Now, maybe we shouldn't, because who knows, he's painting himself into a corner. He's trying to show that he's tough. And in 10 days, people are asking him, okay, what are you going to do? And maybe he'll feel the need to do something.
Yeah, I feel like he is going to do something. I mean, do you think it's more that the Russians are responding this way, or markets responding this way because they think that Trump is just not going to do anything, or he's going to chicken out real quick, even though he's up the timeline and is just saying, like, this is a pretty firm thing, 10 days, a real
Hmm.
ultimatum statement. It's not something that I feel like should be taken so lightly. Or are people just ignoring it because they'd say, okay, well, even if you do your sanctions or your secondary tariffs, is that enforceable? Like, we don't care because you can't force us to do anything. So what is it? Do they think people aren't going to do it, or they
Yeah.
just say like, even if you do it, it doesn't have any impact?
Yeah. I think it's a combination of the two. I mean, that maybe he won't do it. Okay. And then if he does, though, he'll find that it's impossible to enforce. The Chinese have already said outright, that you have no business, you can't do this. We're a sovereign nation, you can't interfere. And I believe the Indians have said pretty much the same thing. And those are the two major importers of Russian oil. It's so I think that's what it's saying, that if he actually tries to go ahead with it, now that is going to create a certain amount of turmoil short term. As you remember, like when he tried to impose those very high tariffs on China earlier, um, the, yeah, that he actually took us to the edge. Now, I guess they're just betting it's not going to go even so far this time. He's going to declare it. Maybe there'll be 5 days or something, and then of where he puts those sanctions in effect, then he'll declare victory and move on to something else, even though nothing was accomplished. I think maybe that's what the markets are expecting. That's what the Russian public is expecting. And that's more or less what I'm expecting.
Right. Well, I mean, with the initial trade tariffs against China, I mean, this is about trade between the United States and China. But we have here is you're talking about sanctioning countries like China and India for trade between China and Russia. They have no
Right.
jurisdiction here. So is that why it's not
Yeah.
causing the markets to go into turmoil? Do they have a way of enforcing it? Like, is there anything
Well,
that?
sure. Yeah, well, I mean, he can put 100% tariffs on China. He's done it before, right? Had 145%, and now we're down to 30%, which is still quite high. But yeah, he can do it again. There's nothing that
Okay,
prevents him from doing it.
so
Okay,
explain
but
to me what's happening with the secondary
right.
tariffs. So it's like he
Okay,
says you're doing trade. Okay, go ahead.
right. Okay, if China continues to buy oil and gas from China, I mean from Russia rather, which they will do. Okay, then that will trigger the 100% tariffs on all Chinese goods that are exported to the United States. So, those Chinese goods, when they come into the U.S., they're going to have 100% tariff. So it's going to be 130%, right? We already have the 30%. And so it's going to be 130. So we're pretty much back to where we were before. And, once again, and the Chinese are not, probably going to respond like they did before. Remember, they went up to 125. And then we're waging economic war once again. But remember how that ended. And I don't see how this is going to end any differently. The Chinese we are so dependent on Chinese goods. And anybody who shops at Walmart or any of a number of retailers knows that. And we're also, our industries, including our military industrial complex, is dependent on Chinese rare earths. And so anyway, they have all the leverage in this case. We back down and what's changed? Nothing has changed, and so, yeah, we're going to have to back down a second time. There's just no question about it. And then the crazy thing is that there are these ongoing negotiations between the Chinese and the Americans. The Americans are led by Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury in London. And they just recently agreed to extend the temporary agreement, the one where we have, 30% tariffs on Chinese goods going into the U.S. and 10% tariffs on American goods going into China, to extend it another 90 days. So then what is this 10-day thing? Because this 10-day would just completely blow these negotiations and, breach that agreement. Again, it just doesn't make any sense. It's just so ridiculous on however you look at it that, yeah, I guess people just are refusing to react. They're just not treating it as, a statement made by an actual, competent president of the United States.
Yeah, I guess maybe I didn't really realize that it was the tariffs would be just on goods come from China into the United States, because that's the only way we can collect them. I guess that's, slapping the secondary tariffs. That's what it meant. I didn't fully understand that, because it just, I thought we were supposed to be threatening Russia and China. This is putting a gun to the U.S. consumer. This is screwing us. This isn't attacking them. This is attacking Americans, right? I mean, that's the way to look at it. Like, all of a sudden, how it's things are so expensive here. Like everyone, just everything. Like, just told him my AC unit went out, and the price has gone up considerably. Or from when my last one blew out, and then I just know things are going up so high for everybody. And then, like, I see people posting, like, I saw some guy that his unit went out and he's like, I can't afford to get a new one. I just feel like a failed father. It's just like, things are tough for Americans. And now this is going to hurt everybody here in the United States. If you slap this, like, we won't be able to get anything done here affordably. It's crazy. That's really what he's saying, that he's threatening us. Why aren't more people telling him how stupid this is?
Right. Well, actually, his tariff policy in general has not been popular. And because people, I think, do fear the higher prices, because that's just an inevitable consequence. You may not see the higher prices right away. Sometimes it takes a whole year for them to really bite. There are goods in stock, and countries don't change their price, or not countries, but rather companies don't change their pricing policies right away. But inevitably, one way or another, you cannot put even a 30% tariff and not see a considerable price increase. And 100%, when you add another 100% on top of the 30%, you're essentially just shutting down trade. We're not even talking about higher prices. We're just a total absence of the goods and products that people want.
So why make this 10-day demand then, if everybody just thinks, if you think he's going to have to cave in on it? Do you think there's something else he might try to do instead? Or is it, is the, sanctions and secondary tariffs, is this just misdirection?
Yeah, I just don't think he knows what he's doing. He has this abiding faith in tariffs. And then he has a way of sort of in creating his own reality. There were these recent trade agreements between the U.S. and Japan and the U.S. and Europe. The one between the U.S. and Europe was the most recent one. He threatened 30% tariffs on Europe. And then very recently, I guess it was just yesterday, that it was announced that Europe had agreed to 15% tariffs, which is, significant, but trade will continue. It's going to hurt. It's the sort of thing when you have a 15% tariff, it becomes a question of elasticity, the elasticity of demand. What that means is, there's certain products that people just feel like they have to have, and they can't do without, they can't find a replacement. So you raise the price by 15%. Okay, I don't like that, but I got to pay for it. And so if Europe has those kind of products supplied to the U.S., they'll be able to continue to sell them. But then if demand is elastic, that means that people say, well, wait a second, I don't really need this. And now it costs, $100 more, $150 more. It's just not worth it. I'm not going to buy it. They stop buying it. Or I can get something very similar from this other supplier or from another country. And, I prefer the European, but now that it's 15%, forget it. I'm going to buy something from China or something or wherever. So, that's really what it comes down to. And some European exporters will be okay, but others are going to suffer. It's going to hurt European economies and industries overall, But then there was another part of this deal, and that was that, according to Trump, the Europeans had agreed to buy $750 billion worth of LNG, liquefied natural gas, from the U.S. over the next 3 years, and would also invest $600 billion in the U.S. Now, a lot of people have pointed out that, okay, it was the EU, it was Ursula von der Leyen that agreed to this on behalf of the EU, but she doesn't really have the authority to agree to this, because we're talking about private investment. The EU or the European Commission can't force private companies in different European countries to invest certain amounts of money in the U.S. Nor can they. And then as far as the liquefied natural gas goes, even if the Europeans really wanted to do that, they can't. Right now, I guess last year, if you look at it, or maybe like this year, like we're on track. Yeah, LNG purchases from the U.S. have been increasing, because of the cutoff of Russian gas. It's much more expensive, but, they're forced to buy this LNG that's like 4 times more expensive than the gas they used to get from Russia. But they're talking about amounts that would be 6 times what they're doing right now. And they just don't have the capacity. They don't have, the dock facilities and, there's a whole infrastructure that's needed for LNG. And it's not even clear that the U.S. has that much to give them. So both of these numbers are just, are fictitious. They're just made up, basically. And, something that Trump boasts about. Now, he did the same thing actually with Japan. Remember, they agreed to, was it also 15% tariff, something like that. And again, the Japanese were supposed to invest a huge amount, hundreds of billions of dollars in the U.S. economy. And this is something that Trump, boasted about. This really big numbers, great deal, incredible. This is going to create all kinds of jobs, great for America. Another great success scored by Trump. Now, the Japanese were recently asked about this, and, you're really going to invest this much? And they said, oh, maybe we'll do 2% of that amount. I mean, he just says stuff. These are numbers that are meaningless. And so this is why, we shouldn't completely disregard what he says, but you can't blame, governments and in general, the publics, the peoples of the world from just starting to just kind of tune out, because so much of it does not make sense.
So are these even real deals? Never happen,
because it cannot happen. Yeah, well, that's the thing, because normally when you work out a trade deal, these are very, very complex agreements. And normally you have teams of negotiators, and you spend a lot of time, and the long doc, the pages and pages, and and both teams go over, and dot the I's and cross the T's, and they squabble and about this or that particular provision, and eventually it's worked out. But that's just not, Trump doesn't seem to have any patience or interest in that, in real negotiation. It's just it's a big deal with some big numbers afterwards. So, we say these things and then it's just not clear if anything's going to happen. The same thing, let's go back to the NATO deal. Again, it was just that, yeah, America is, okay, the weapons will be supplied by Ukraine, but Europe is going to buy them. And then you threw out some numbers. There's 17 Patriot systems, whatever he means by systems, it was never clear. And that Germany was going to do this and whatever. Now, like the Germans were saying, we don't really know what we're going to do, and we don't really have anything to provide now, maybe 2 years from now. It's just, so it's not clear what's happening in any of these so-called big deals. It just isn't.
Right. I mean, I don't know if you remember as well. I mean, he did that big trip to Qatar and Saudi Arabia, UAE, and secured like trillions of dollars worth of investments and got a jumbo jet, which I'm sure he's very happy about. But,
yeah,
it's probably the same thing. It's just, you're right. When I think about it now, it's like we make all these deals, but they're not really deals, are they? I mean, it's the same thing. We have all these, contracts, negotiations, these agreements, ceasefires. They're all just lies. They're all just phony now. It just, nothing seems to be legitimate. It just, people are just, sure, yeah, we'll sign this piece of paper. We know it means nothing anymore. So we just, we can just sign it. And then maybe we get something out of you. And then you can tell people that we signed this, but nobody has to honor it. Like that's a weird place to be in as a country. Like that's chaos right now.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Well, often it's something like it's a huge amount over the next 10 years. And, like in the case of Qatar or UAE, they say, yeah. And then, they know that there's going to be another president and at some point people are going to even forget about the deal. And I don't think there are any rush to make good on their promises there. Now, remember too, there was the deal, again, another NATO deal. Each NATO member was going to commit 5% of its GDP, right, to NATO. But, if you look at it closely, well, first of all, it's not really 5%, or, it's really military. They can actually say like infrastructure spending, let's say improvements of roads and bridges, to just give one example. That can be 1.5% of it could be that. And then there's just all kinds of ways to game the system. In the end, I don't think anybody, maybe one or two countries will actually go to 5%. Italy was talking about some bridge that they were planning to build, to from the mainland to Sicily, a huge multi-billion euro project. And they were going to make that part. They were going to label that defense spending. That's how these 5% targets are going to be met.
So with the EU deal, why would Ursula von der Leyen agree to a 15% tariff for all of EU? Does she have the authority to represent all of the countries within the EU to do that? I mean, individual countries can't work out their own deals. I mean, that's the problem with the EU, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that's a problem. I mean, it is. The EU is an economic, it's the EU, a European Union. It began as an economic organization. It's primary, and it's obviously gone beyond purely economic agreements. But that is its main purpose. That is its raison d'être. So yeah, she does have the authority. Nobody has denied that she does, because it used to be that the U.S. or any other country had to make individual treaties or reach individual agreements with the different countries, each of which had its own currency. Now there's, one EU with one euro, and you can, and, once a product enters the region of the EU, there are no tariffs between countries. So, the tariff agreements have to be made through the EU and not through the individual countries. Now, a lot of the Europeans are quite upset about it. The French prime minister just thought it was, he thought it was a humiliation, and that it was wrong, that the EU should not be subservient to the U.S. Because even if all the talk about the hundreds of billions of dollars in purchases and investment, if that's just total nonsense, 15%, that's a big deal. That's going to hurt a lot of companies throughout Europe.
Right. So why do you think that they agreed to this type of deal if it seemed like it was just purely punitive to the EU? Is this the price that Ursula von der Leyen thought we have to pay to keep Trump in the war with Russia?
I think that's a big part of it. Right. Ukraine seems to be the number one concern of the EU political class, and that's what they want to do. And whatever they can do, they're willing to accede to many of his demands if that's going to keep and tie him closer to Europe and continue, supporting Project Ukraine. So I think that's part of it. And then also it's just that the EU has very foolishly made itself completely dependent on the US. I mean, it's joined the US and, obviously in this struggle against Russia. So it doesn't have a Russian option, right? And it's willingly deprived itself of Russian energy and everything else Russian. But it's also joined the hostilities, not a full-fledged war or anything, but the general hostile attitude towards China, and it just makes it more difficult. They have tied themselves so closely to the U.S. They made themselves very dependent on the U.S. and they just don't have, much of a, they don't have many options. Now, in a multipolar world, different countries can actually, you don't need to tie themselves to one power, right? They can maintain friendly relationships with different powers, and that gives them room in which to maneuver. It gives them options. But Europe has chosen not to be part of the multipolar world, but just to hitch its wagon to, Western hegemony. And that means to the U.S.
Right. And that basically means as what the Western empire begins to crumble and fall, it's just going to suck whatever it can out of its vassals, right? And that's what we're seeing. That's what this is. That's what Japan did. That's what the EU did, is they bowed down and said, sure, we will increase our tithe to you so you can keep on living your decadent lifestyle.
Yeah, you could put it that way. Sure.
Well, I think it's really, it's really dangerous when countries like Japan, Qatar, and the EU agree to these deals with Trump, even if the deals themselves don't mean anything. Because the problem is it allows them to think that I still have the power. I can dictate reality. Look at me. They're still kissing my ass. I go over there and they say, yes, sir, yes, sir. And they sign it. And I can come back and say, look at this, $2 trillion, 650 billion, whatever it is. They're just phony numbers anyways, but it gives him a big win. And then so he's able to do this because these countries cave. And then he goes to Russia and dictates something like this, says, you got 10 days, we're tough, look at all these other countries lining up. I think that's the problem. Whenever he has one of these wins, it just sort of feeds that God complex that's like, yes, I can do whatever I want. If they stayed strong and said like, hey, no, let's calm down, then he would keep on hitting with those doses of reality. But they're feeding into this ego trip of his. And I think that's that might be part of the reason that we're seeing this type of behavior with regards to
I think that's a
Russia
good
and
point.
China.
Right. I think that's true. But of course, he's going to come up again against hard realities in both cases, in the case of Russia and of China. And we'll just see how he deals with it. He did, he had to back down the first time, in the first economic war against China. And we'll see.
Do you think there's any chance that NATO would do something as crazy as take Kaliningrad? Because there was that statement, I know you heard of it from, I forget the guy's name, some general.
I think it was Christopher Donahue, I believe. Yeah. It's very worrying. I found that kind of shocking. It's just like, what was the point of that statement? One thing I thought of, and it's just like, if you really do have that ability, it's not something really to advertise. It seems to me. Why is he advertising it? Is it just part of? Is it because they worry that people are starting to look at NATO as a paper tiger? The narrative is starting to just look a little, kind of ragged around the edges, and they need to spruce it up and to reinvigorate it. I don't know, but it was an alarming kind of statement to make. What is it? That is, Kaliningrad is Russia. It's part of Russia. It's, an attack. You're talking about attacking Russia. There has been a lot of actually very bellicose statements made by European political leaders, and both on both sides of the Atlantic, especially in the UK and Germany, but also Poland. And you hear again, that there is. They don't just predict that there might be a war, but they seem to expect that there will be a war. They tell their people that they need to prepare for a war against Russia in the next 2 to 5 years. And it's not just one or two leaders that have said that, but a dozen over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and it's quite alarming. I don't really know what's going on. It's again. It's probably all just rhetoric. It's a lot of chest beating. Maybe it's for them, they don't really have any plans to do anything, but you're left to wonder. It's just, do they really mean it when they expect war with Russia in 2 to 5 years?
Right. I think for the average everyday citizen living in Europe or the US, we don't feel like we're at war with Russia. But the problem is that there are parts of our government or the deep state that are already in that mindset that we're at war with Russia. And I think that's embodied in our intelligence agencies, CIA, MI6. In their mindset, in their mind, I think they already know they're at war with Russia because they are, right? Do you think that's a correct way to frame it? That these intelligence agencies, because we've heard them, the MI6 involved with things from Kursk to potentially Operation Spiderweb, direct attacks, all these drone attacks into Russia, that's being, conducted by or orchestrated in large part by intelligence agencies like the MI6 and the CIA. We know that the CIA had over 15 bases in eastern Ukraine prior to the SMO. And we know that we've been laying out all of the framework, and these CIAs, they have these black budgets, these black boxes. Who knows how much money's going in? They're controlling it. They are fully involved in this war. In terms of the intelligence side, we are at war with Russia, right? And that's what's so scary. And then they can use their levers of power to try to push the rest of the government into war with Russia because this is their game. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's accurate to say? That
again, it's more than just a proxy war. Maybe we can't say we are directly at war with them, but we are, we're in this gray area between, a typical proxy war and direct war. It's not that our troops are on the ground in uniforms in any significant numbers actually shooting at Russian troops. Thank God that that's not happening yet. Or that our fighter pilots have invaded Russian airspace and are, firing missiles or dropping bombs on Russian territory. But as you point, we provide the intelligence, we provide target data, and, we train, and then we know that, actually, again, from the generals themselves, that they have been involved. They haven't just, again, supplied the weapons and given suggestions, but they've actually become involved at the tactical level in these battles. Actually provide targets again at the tactical level. There's a unit on top of this hill or in this tree line. Hit them. This is direct involvement. And then, again, of course, there's the ATACMS that when they're launched, they're not launched by Ukraine by themselves, but we are actually launching those missiles. And it would certainly be true of Tomahawks or JASSMs. So yeah, we are, maybe it's not quite right to say that we are at war with them, but we're very nearly at war with them. We're in this gray area again between a proxy war and a direct war. These intelligence agencies and NATO generals, they know it, and they've put their reputations on the line. And for them, this is becoming something of an existential struggle, at least, if not really for Europe, because look, Russia doesn't have any intention of invading Europe. It is existential for them. I think that's how they perceive it. This is like, if they lose this, it could very well be the end of NATO, or if NATO survives, it's never going to be the same NATO. We're going to look at it as something different. It went into this war again as, the most feared and supposedly the most successful, the most powerful military alliance in history. But if we are soundly defeated in Ukraine, because it really will be a NATO project, whatever we say, and they know it is, and I think most of the world knows that it is too. It's even if NATO holds together, it's just not going to be the same NATO. It's going to be its stature will be greatly reduced. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, if you're saying that we're providing targeting data and actually directing the battlefield in a large extent, then certain agencies, parts of the government, are at war with Russia already. And so it's just, like you said, we're in this gray zone already. And that's dangerous because we're just moving further and further. And if we're able to have people like a general of the United States Army to say, yeah, we can take Kaliningrad in 24 or 48 hours, like and people aren't freaking out about that. It just shows you how far we've gone. I mean, imagine, we heard Russia saying, okay, yeah, we can take Alaska back. It could take us, we can take Fairbanks in, 2 days, 3 days, something like this, like how crazy that statement would be, and how much news that would make. But then we have a U.S. general here. Sure, it's causing some stir, but mainly just within this dissident community. But most people are just like, yeah, okay, whatever, just saying, well, that's just the U.S. doing what it does. And I don't think people are realizing how dangerous this can come. And if people are apathetic about these types of statements, it just shows you that we're in trouble, that we are kind of at war, and it just nuts.
Right.
It's just nuts. I can't believe this.
Yeah, Kaliningrad is Russia. You take Kaliningrad, you have invaded Russia, you have started World War III, and Kaliningrad is where, various kinds of strategic weapons, including nuclear missiles, I believe, are based. You take Kaliningrad, you have started World War III, and it could very well go nuclear. And the Russians responded very strongly to that. They noticed, they heard that statement, and they said, yeah, you take Kaliningrad, and we could very well have a nuclear war.
Right. And, we have what he said. The Polish president said, yeah, we'll be at war with Russia in 2027. And there's been quite a few political leaders, right, that are just sort of saying,
yeah,
get ready to prepare for war with Russia. So it's just like their mind's made up, and it's just like, this is insane. Well, and I'm kind of surprised that we're not getting more of a pushback. We're slowly slipping into this, and it's just
right. Again, this is the political class. It's not the people of Europe. The German generals, for example, really want to build up their army. And maybe this is part of it. Possibly, you can look at this very cynically. All this talk about war with Russia, it may be just a way of, increasing budgets. You have to have a boogeyman. You have to scare the people, get them to cough up more money, to agree to, cuts in services and so on and so forth. So you scare them, and maybe that's all it is. You wonder, because we do have a real, a near war going on. Again, this proxy war, and more than a proxy war in Ukraine. But yeah, again, the Ukrainian generals want to build up their army, but they just don't have. There's really very little interest, within the population. Young people don't want to sign up. They're just not. The same thing is true in the UK and other countries. There's very, very little enthusiasm. So again, that's just sort of what's always given me some hope. Is clearly there are leaders, political and military within Europe that are champing at the bit, who really seem to want war. And again, Macron himself and Starmer, and Merz, they often talk that way. These are people, these are men that seem to really want war. But maybe they're just not going to have their war because their people are not going to go along with it. Let's hope so.
Well, what's the state of Ukraine now? I saw some Western media headline. I forget which newspaper had it, but it was saying that Ukraine is severely attrited now. Openly admitting that they are no longer able to replenish the manpower or weaponry, so that it's starting to break through a bit more through the West. But we've been talking about the possibility of, is Ukraine collapsing? It seems like for a year, like it always seems like things have been looking bad ever since after the summer offensive, but they just hold on and they just grind, and the casualties keep on amounting. They keep on being attrited. It's horrible for the Ukrainians. They're just getting just pummeled constantly. But are we actually?
Yeah. No.
Would you say we're coming to a collapse now, finally, or?
I honestly don't know. I know I hear a lot of, like, my fellow commentators are saying that there's a real acceleration. When I look at the statistics, it doesn't look really very different from last year. I think we're still not where we were in the fall of last year. We're not. I should say Russia is not advancing, still not as fast as it was, let's say, in November of last year. Faster than it was at this time a year ago, but not much faster. That was after the fall of Avdiivka. There are important advances, and Pokrovsk is important. It looks like, they've actually penetrated into Pokrovsk, and they continue to extend the pinchers around it. Pokrovsk, is going to fall, and it might fall faster than we thought. But that, Pokrovsk, if you look at the whole, map of Ukraine, or even like the eastern half of it, it's an important logistical hub. There's no question about it. It's important because it's like the first city in a series of cities leading up to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And it will be I think it's fair to say that's the beginning of the end for Donetsk. But Donetsk is just actually one oblast, one region. And the Russians have committed to also taking Zaporozhye, and they still got a long ways to go on Zaporozhye. And Zaporozhye city is huge. It's much, much larger than, Pokrovsk. And then Kherson, and to regain the rest of Kherson, they have to cross the river, and that's going to be very hard. There are a lot of, when I look at it, it seems to me that we still have a lot of war to fight. And though, there are signs, I think it's true, there's no question about it, that that Ukrainian defenses are becoming increasingly thin, and they may very well be on the verge of collapse. But as you say, I've been hearing this for like 2 years. So I'm just, one of these days it's going to be true. We'll see it, but I'm not seeing it quite yet. When I'm reading the accounts of the different battles, the Ukrainians are still throwing in reinforcements, still trying these counterattacks. And they're still fighting hard in a lot of these places and slowing the Russians down. The counterattacks are very rarely successful. They usually don't do anything, and they just end up, killing a lot of Ukrainians. Sometimes they manage to take back, let's say, half a village, but then definitely within a week, the Russians take it again. That happens. But it does slow the Russians down. They're able to slow them down on several points. And so it looks like, the same old thing, but that again, that's the way it is with a war of attrition. And we can think about it in the case of World War I. I mean, those lines hardly moved at all for a long time. And then finally the lines did collapse. It may be right around the corner, but I'm not holding my breath. It could be, in a few more months before we start to see a collapse. It might be a whole year, who knows, or even longer. I think there's still a lot of war to be fought. And the Russians are being careful. I think, we know that they have all these troops in reserve, well-equipped units. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of men. They could throw them in. But I think, I know within Russia, there's a lot of debate about this. There are a lot of Russians who think that that the Russian command is being too cautious, and they need to just bring this war to an end, and but for whatever reason, the Russians haven't done that, and part of it is that they are being careful, very careful with Russian lives. And, it's easy for us standing back here, so yeah, big aero offensive, let's whatever. But just imagine if it's your son that's on the front line in one of those units, you would want them to be really careful, right? And
Right. When the Russians come in and take these cities like Pokrovsk, or if they march onto Zaporozhye, which you said is a large city, do they get emptied out largely before the fighting starts, or like?
Right.
Well, what happens to the people living there?
Yeah, most of them are evacuated. Most of them leave the city. There are always some hangers-on, some who just do not want to leave their properties and just want to wait for the Russians. And I remember that happened in Avdiivka, for example. Avdiivka was really pummeled. There were hundreds and hundreds of FABs, these huge, 1 ton, 2 ton bombs dropped on Avdiivka. But when the Russians took it, these people, a lot of older men and women came out of their basements and hugged the Russian soldiers. I think we're talking about a pretty small part of the population, maybe 1, 2, 3% or something, but they just stay. And I think that's probably true in Pokrovsk.
Okay, yeah, I'm wondering because while we're still in the Donbass and Zaporozhye, these are regions that were largely sympathetic to Russia. So I'm just wondering if the civilians,
very sympathetic.
Right. So the civilians that are living there in these cities, do they feel occupied fully by the Ukrainians? And, when the Russians come and take it, if they fled for safety, they can't go back to their city, right? Because now it's Russian occupied territory. The Ukraine won't let them, right? So, is that what happens?
It's going to be hard, I guess. Right. Yeah, well, that's a good question. I wondered about that. I think, that there are ways to get. There's certainly ways to get to Russia. If they're allowed to leave Ukraine, there's always ways to enter Russia, via a third country. So I think that's probably what a lot of these people are doing. It's just, I can't blame them. Yeah, I would rather, if I were a resident of a city like Pokrovsk, I would rather be there under Russian occupation. I think the great majority of the residents think that way. But, for the Russians to take Pokrovsk, they've got to pummel it because the Ukrainian soldiers are using these buildings as fortresses. This is they're using the basements, and they're using the, apartment towers as fortresses. They have their gun nests up there on the higher floors. And so a great deal of damage is done to these cities because they're fought within the cities. And so it's got to be, first of all, a terrifying experience, and then a real chance that you're going to be killed. So even if I want to be, under Russian occupation, I don't want to live through this battle. So a lot of these people do agree to be evacuated, but there's always a hardcore,
I'm not leaving.
A few, again,
right.
Just maybe a couple percent. Yeah, I am. Yeah, I think that's always true. Actually, like in India, I'm not leaving this house, and they stay.
Right.
And some of them do get killed, but others survive, and they are able to welcome the Russian soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of wonder if you're a Ukrainian occupying these cities that are in eastern Ukraine, places like Pokrovsk, are you not worried if the majority of citizens are sympathetic to Russia? I mean, do they view these citizens as potential informants or enemies? Or do they realize they're not wanted there? Like, I think that's something that
right.
I was just going to say, I think most people that don't have a firm understanding of the conflict in Ukraine just assume that, okay, yeah, Russia's invading and that everybody's in eastern Ukraine is like these evil Russian barbarians are coming through and, burning our cities and raping our women and killing our men. That's the image that they try to present without realizing that actually these people have been involved in a civil war since 2014,
right.
Fighting against the Western Ukraine, that this really was a civil war conflict, and that the majority of these people in eastern Ukraine Our Russian speakers identify as Russians. Their rights have been trampled since the overthrow of their democratic elected government in 2014. They have been waging this war for a long time. Yeah, and so, but it just makes me wonder, like all these people, it makes me feel like I'm surprised that there aren't more uprisings. I wonder how Ukraine's able to kind of control a population, in eastern Ukraine that doesn't want to be under their control.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they've got all the guns, that's
okay. Yeah.
And, organized violence, it's numbers, you can, right. Maybe, how it is, right? Yeah. I think the majority of the people in these towns in eastern Ukraine and Donetsk do not want to be under Ukrainian control, want to be part of Russia. If I remember correctly, it was actually the rebellion that set off the civil war, the rebellion against the new Ukrainian regime that took power in 2014, started in the Kramatorsk-Slavyansk area. So again, that's where it started. Okay? So when the Russians get there, there's going to be a sense, finally, this is this objective was achieved. No, recently I haven't heard anything, but I remember in the first year or two of the war that you would hear accounts from Ukrainian soldiers, actually complaints, saying the people here they're all pro-Russian, just really annoyed by the fact, but they admitted it was true.
Yeah, well, do you think this war you said you think it can grind down a lot more, there's a lot more war left. Do you think this is going to extend well into 2026 even? I mean, do you think this is going to evolve? Will we have direct NATO involvement? I mean...
Yeah, well, that's the fear. I mean, this is the thing. This is the argument, too, that I've heard from both sides. Like Jim Jatras and others, I think a lot of people within Russia, he's not Russian, but he's very closely tied to Russia. He was a former State Department employee. Says that he thinks it actually increases the danger of NATO involvement just by extending the war, by going at it slowly. That eventually,
I agree.
I can understand his point. I see it. And now others like Eve Smith, she's made the argument of naked capitalism, that you don't make any sudden moves around a crazy person. She puts it that way. It's actually the Russians want to move slowly because a sudden move, like a sudden breakthrough, a big aero offensive, a sudden march on Kiev, that could, provoke an hysterical, reckless response by the West.
Right.
But I can see both sides of it. I understand, I can see both sides of this argument.
Yeah, I think just the most damning thing is just when we take a step back and just realize where we are when we have Trump saying, "Oh, I'm done talking with Putin. He's got 10 days." Just issuing an ultimatum like that. When we have a U.S. general talking about invading Russia, Kaliningrad, when there's open discussion of shooting longer range missiles into places like Moscow or St. Petersburg. Supposedly, Trump asked Zelensky, "Do you think you can hit Moscow or St. Petersburg?" I mean, just that's an insane statement. Apparently, nuclear tactical nukes are being sent to Great Britain. Like, what's going on? All these political leaders are saying, get ready for war with Russia. We've been saying that in large sense. MI6, CIA, they're already at war with Russia. So it's just the problem with moving this slow. Just look at where we are from the start of this SMO to where we are now, and the types of conversations we're having. And we're looking at, we're wanting to punish countries like China and India because Russia is still doing well. We're completely running empty on all of these munitions. Ukraine is running out of men. We have nothing left in our arsenal. Like you said, like these bone-crushing sanctions, secondary tariffs or whatever that we're wanting to place on countries like China and India, like this is just a sign of desperation because nothing else has worked. So you're just saying insane crap and just hoping that something happens. I don't know, but like we said, it's going to hurt the American people more than anybody. And militarily, like, what can we do? We've already sent everything. We don't have any more, air defense systems or anything like this. You were just saying that all of the militaries, nobody's signing up. Nobody wants this war. So we're just I just don't understand Trump. He's so, I don't know. You think that somebody that became a billionaire would be intelligent, that you have to be smart, the art of the deal. You have to understand people and understand the big picture to be able to make it. But maybe our system's just so broken that we nothing about America is meritocracy. Nothing about America is actually, if you're competent and smart and do well, that doesn't get you to the top. Instead, it's just if you just lie and just have been overly confident or whatever, or you have the right connections, then you can make it. That's the only way. Like how is he so stupid? Like I just don't understand. That was always something in the back of my mind. I was like, well, Trump was a successful businessman, right? He built a business empire. He should have some common sense, but it seems like he has zero. I don't get it.
Yeah, right. Well, I suppose like just being successful within like within the world of New York real estate, and also of reality TV. There's one thing. It shows you have to have a certain kind of smarts, but it just doesn't necessarily apply to international relations. It really doesn't. And there are people that know how work very well within their own milieus, but they just don't understand other countries and other people. So they never took an interest in it, and it's always, just a mystery to them. They kind of assume that they got to be like the people they know and respond to the kind of pressures that they know how to apply to other people that are dealing within again your very small circle, and it just doesn't work that way. The international relations is something completely different. And you need to, somebody who's got smarts. Well, he also has to have a certain amount of humility. You say, okay, I understand this very well. I don't. I need experts. And the thing is, Trump hasn't done that. He's found loyalists. So he's got Steve Witkoff, who's, again, is probably one of his better representatives, or, clearly a smart guy, but he doesn't know anything about these countries. He doesn't know anything about international relations. And, again, you have to have the experts. You really do. Again, he suspects the experts, with good reason, you can say, yet he can't do without them.
Yeah, I mean, if we had a system that truly worked, you feel like people like Colonel Douglas McGregor would become our Secretary of Defense, and we could have people like John Mearsheimer and, advising Thomas Massie with Jeffrey Sachs. Like, that's how it should be, but we just those guys have been exiled. You're not allowed to have it. The only people that are allowed to be in the government are the ones that are just spouting nonsense and that I want to live in this crumbling false reality that America is a hyperpower that can just dictate reality wherever it wants, left and right. And it's scary, man.
Yeah. I remember actually, one person who's very much part of the dissident community now is Chas Freeman, the former interpreter for President Nixon in China, and then ambassador to Saudi Arabia, a very illustrious diplomatic career. He was considered for a high-level position in the State Department under Obama, but he was shot down by the Zionists. That's the kind of thing that happens.
Yeah. Okay, well, we can end it soon, but I just want to touch a little bit on Gaza before we end. Can you give us an update? Okay. What's going on there? Is there any, more aid able to get in? I mean, how bad is the starvation? What's it looking like?
It's the starvation seems to be accelerating. I'm surprised actually again that the Gazans held out for so long. Clearly they were malnourished but we're having very few, actual deaths, direct deaths from malnourishment. But that's increasing now. So whereas it was before maybe a dozen in a month, now we're having something like a dozen a day. So it looks like that the deaths from starvation are unfortunately increasing, and we can only expect that to accelerate. Now, it's just the horror of this has gotten through to, apparently even Fox News has shown some pictures of malnourished children, and it's and it's affecting, it's getting through. It just can't hide it. So the Israelis have been forced to at least announce some changes in their policy. They said they were going to allow airdrops, and I think some airdrops have been done now. But as these relief agencies, the real relief agencies point out, that's a very inefficient way. You can't really get much in by way of airdrops, and airdrops are dangerous. They injure and kill people. And I think the airdrops that were done recently did injure a number of people. You need to have UNRWA, these large, experienced relief agencies go in there. And they say they have like 3 months worth of food just right on the other side of the border. And if the Israelis let them in, they can do it. Now, the Israelis were saying that they would do have like maybe 10-hour cessation of hostilities a day to allow more aid in. And it's not clear. I think there have been some, there has been a slight increase in aid, but it's nowhere near sufficient. Again, the population is really just teetering on the brink right now. People are dying, especially children. They seem to die from starvation sooner than adults do. But then the adults, you can go on in a malnourished state for a long time. You think about it, like somebody who actually, it maybe is in prison and just, as a statement, as a protest, refuses all food. This voluntary starvation is something that happens. But people can last for 2 months, without a bite to eat, and then they die, Now these people will get like an occasional bite, maybe just one very small meal a day. They're undernourished. They're only getting like 25% or 1/3 of what they really need. But they can survive. They can stay alive, but they just can't fully function. They're weakened, greatly weakened by it. And that's what we're seeing in the hospitals. You have doctors who are fainting. You have these long shifts. They're, obviously under tremendous pressure because the whole health infrastructure has been so greatly damaged and degraded. And they just don't have the strength. Many of them just say they just can't even perform their duties anymore. They're not at the point of dying, but they're in such a weakened state. So, this is, again, it's just a very dire situation. The Israelis have been forced to respond because it's just looking so bad, that even some of their longtime, strongest supporters have kind of maybe gently told them, you got to do something different. This is looking really bad. For example, we had Keir Starmer, who was a very fervent Zionist and has always supported Israel. Said that if this doesn't, if the siege doesn't end soon, he's going to declare his support for a Palestinian state in September. And I think it's symbolic, but it still does. The Israelis don't want that to happen. I find it kind of a strange statement. Like in his case, it's just like, if it's the right thing to do, you should just do it. It's not supposed to be a punishment to the Israelis, something you use to prod them. But anyway, we'll just leave that aside. So yeah, they're responding, but I think it just, through, not in any, the siege continues. Maybe there's been a slight increase in aid, but it's more symbolic than anything else, and it's just an effort to distract and to reduce the criticism. And the plans for ethnic cleansing go ahead. I continue. I think it's clear. A combination of just outright extermination and forcible resettlement. I think we may get a statement from the Israeli government in the not too distant future that they're simply going to take parts of Gaza.
Will that elicit some response from the world, or I mean, if this hasn't elicited a response, if starving a civilian population where we can see it, and just the some of the most horrific things I see are just when these poor people are trying to get food, and then they just get shot at and just slaughtered. There's this
right every day. I mean, that's every day. We're talking about like dozens of people every day. So we're well over 1,000 Gazans have been killed just trying to get, starving Gazans have been killed trying to get food.
And so if this doesn't elicit a response, a direct intervention to save these people, then nothing will, right? I mean, when they go into annex, I mean, like at what point I'm just waiting for, I'm just surprised, I'm horrified that nothing has been done. The only people doing anything are the Yemenis, the Houthis, and they are very limited in their ability, and I know Iran has been, doing support.
Iran supports for the Houthi, support for Hezbollah. Hezbollah did quite a bit and paid a huge price. Let's not forget Hezbollah. I think really you can argue that the Iranians paid the price too. It was because they were the Axis resistance, because they supported Hezbollah and the Houthis. That's what made them such a target.
If there's any salvation for the Palestinians, would it come from the Iranians if the war starts back up and this time they really go after the Zionist regime and this, I think everybody was hoping, when things were kicking up in Iran and Israel, it's like, okay, if we have a ceasefire, just Iran, if you were in the driver's seat, if they were asking for the ceasefire, why didn't you just say, yeah, okay, we'll agree to it, but you have to withdraw from Gaza and aid has to flow back in. Like that would have just, I'm not it's not my position to say, but I just felt like, it was worth at least trying that. And I'm just a little disappointed that it didn't happen. And it just, now we just have to sit here and just watch the most evil horrors being perpetrated, and we just watch it and nothing gets done. It's really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
What can we do? It's so frustrating just being a normal citizen, and everybody's against this. Everybody in the world that has a heart is against this, but it just keeps on happening.
Well, right. Yeah. And I want to point out that in the U.S., I mean, that again, another poll came out that showed, I believe, if I remember this correctly, that only 9% of people in the 18 to 34 age category in the U.S., only 9% viewed Israel's war on Gaza favorably. Only 9%. So it was
still too
disapproved
high.
But I mean, that's such a huge difference. I know. So, I remember the time when Israel could do no wrong and everybody, loved Israel and waved Israeli flags and so on and so forth. There has been a huge shift against Israel. And again, maybe Iran could do something, but probably not. They're not strong enough to actually carry through, to force Israel's hand. I think Israel would not accept that. They could not submit to Iran, and they would, they don't need to, because they have the U.S. at their backs. It's the U.S. that can change it. So it's that 9%, that's what gives me the most hope. But it'll take time for that to work its way through the system and to, and I'm afraid that it's just going to be too late before the U.S. actually does what it needs to do. We have a real change of power. You
say Iran's not powerful enough, but I think what we keep on coming to the conclusion of is that the United States and Israel really aren't that powerful. Sure, against a country that has no air defense and you can fly over and drop bombs, you can wreak havoc. But if Iran bolsters its air defense either through China or Russia, then Israel and the United States have no defenses. That's what was shown during this 12-day war. That's what we see in Ukraine. So I don't know about I think we still put too much stock in the power of the West, of Israel and the United States. The only thing that they have are these nuclear weapons, which is terrifying. And that's why I just feel like the inevitable conclusion of all of our talks is that, we look for off ramps, solutions, conventional ways that this war would continue to escalate, but we're coming close to our ability to engage in any type of conventional combat, whether it's economic or military. And then you just, what kind of machinations will they come up with before they finally come to the final big decision? Do we go nuclear, or do we step back and admit Israel can never step back? The United States, I hope we can. There's no reason for us. We have 2 oceans, and we got Canada, some of the nicest people, sometimes, and then Mexico below on the south. I mean, it's like we're so safe. There's no reason. I just wish that we could just stop it. It just come back home, and let's build some high-speed rail. Want to compete with China? All right, they got some fast trains. Let's see if we can build some fast trains and make our lives better. So I don't have to deal with TSA and getting my real ID or whatever and overpaying to just travel somewhere. There's so much we could do here in this country, and I just wish it's just common sense, and everybody wants that. And just, can we make it happen? Probably not. So
well, it's not. Right. Okay, well, I'm going to have to get ready for the next.
Right, you're going to have a talk with Garland here in a minute. I'll get off here and I'll try to get this out. Okay, Dad. Well, thanks a lot. Have a good chat with Garland, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, very good.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.